Hi, everybody. It's your girl, Marcy Thomas, and I am back with you for another episode of the BGC Book Club. I am so excited to be here with you all today at whatever time you're watching, whether you watch live or you're catching on a replay. Please be sure to put replay in the comments so we know that you came in and checked it out later. But if you follow regularly, you know that I normally, well, two things. I took a couple of weeks off because sometimes you got to take a break just to rest and rejuvenate. And I came back with new hair. So, yes, I had to get it together for everybody and come back looking cute for you guys. But, also, as I said, sometimes it's just important to take a break and be able to come back, be refreshed and ready to go. Now, this is a little earlier time of day than we normally do. It's only 8 p.m., but we have a special international guest with us tonight. So I'm here a little earlier than normal. So if you get a chance, drop a note in the comments to let us know where you're joining us from, if it's your first time, whatever the case may be, and we're going to go ahead and get into it. The BGC Book Club has been around for a couple of years, and I pride myself on bringing some of the best Black women writers from around the world to you, just to talk to you about the things that they're writing about, the stories, his story, or her story, whatever the case may be, so that we can learn not only about some of the great women characters that have been developed, but also get to know some of these great writers and be able to support them. So today's guest I have with me, Lianne Dillsworth, who in 2018 graduated from Royal Holloway with an MA in creative writing with distinction. And in 2019, she won a place in the London Library Emerging Writers Program. Most recently, she was awarded a bursary place for underrepresented writers on the Jericho Writers Self-Editing course and shortlisted for the SI Leeds Literary Prize. She also holds an MA in Victorian Studies, which is going to come up today in today's book, and her love for the period shines through her writing. She currently lives in London, where she also works for the government on growing diversity within the civil service. So without any further delay, Lianne, welcome to the room. Welcome to the BGC Book Club.
Hello, Marcy. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you for adjusting your schedule because I'm in ATL and it is 4:00 in the afternoon and it's 9 p.m. where you are. So I'm in London, so I appreciate that. And as you can see, the book is behind her, and here's my copy of Theater of Marvels. So wonderful. So thanks again. So just tell us a little bit about your backstory and how you got to writing it and why specifically the Victorian period.
Yeah, sure. I've always loved the period, and my mum had taken me to lots of stately homes when I was younger, and sort of walk around and you think, what would it be like if I lived here? So I was always interested in the period, and then I had done a master's in Victorian Studies, as you said. And later on, I'd done the Masters in Creative Writing. I thought, oh, how can I join these two passions together? And historical fiction felt like the right thing. But I also had some really good advice about what I was writing, because this is the second novel I've written, but the first one to get published. And someone said to me that you should write the thing that only you can write. And I thought, oh, there can't be that many people who are interested in the Victorian period and studying around that time, but also in sort of the development of the Black British community. So it felt like the perfect sweet spot for me. So that's where it came from.
And that's really exciting. And as I read in your introduction, it definitely shows up in the work that you have a love for the period and just so much information. Hey, Laura, welcome. She's saying hi from Mississippi. So we've got someone from Mississippi. So welcome, Laura. We also have, I don't know the name, but we have some from Tucson, Arizona. So we are representing all across the United States. And we have Christina who's saying that she's a writer as well. So hopefully you'll pick up something from this, just from this experience in talking to Lianne today. So just give us you don't have to necessarily read the excerpt right now. Sacramento, Suzette Harrison. She's been a guest on here a couple of times. So we got some writers in the room. Yes. So, just without getting into like an excerpt per se right now, just give us kind of an overview of what the book is about for those who may have just jumped on and didn't read the things about it prior to joining us.
Yeah, sure. So it's set in the Victorian period, mid-century, and it's a time when so-called freak shows were really at the height of the popularity. That was how people spent an evening. And my heroine is called Zillah. She is performing on stage at a variety theatre, and she plays the role of an African warrior, but really she was born and raised in London, and the audience can't know about her deception. So she's doing this. She was brought up in the slums. She's desperate to get out. This is her ticket out, this performance. But it starts to make she meets someone who challenges her around what she's doing on stage. And then when another act from the variety show goes missing, she goes on this quest across London to find her. And she ends up in the high society drawing rooms of Mayfair. She's down by the docks. There's a gang that she's mixing with, all to see what she can do to help this woman that's gone missing in mysterious circumstances. But as she's asking more questions and sort of trying to get to the bottom of the disappearance, she's putting herself in danger as well. So you're wondering whether she's going to face ruin or whether she's going to survive and keep going.
Right. There definitely is, there's the history, there is the history and mystery because you really don't know what's going to happen as you're reading. And just that there is quite an interesting cast of characters that play into the story as well. But I really enjoyed Zillah because you can just see her. For me, even though it's not a coming of age story per se, it is definitely a story of self-discovery, in my opinion. That because as she's going through all of these things and trying to help others, she's figuring out how to help herself as well.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think that when we begin the novel, when the reader's first introduced to her, she's thinking very much about herself and her struggle and what she needs to do. But as the novel progresses, she starts to sort of think about the wider world and people outside of her, and it sort of changes her perspective on things quite a lot. So she's growing, hopefully, and she goes on quite an emotional journey within the novel.
Yes, and it is, and we'll get into some of the things that she encounters and people as we move forward. But there, for me personally, I already told you there was a little bit of a connection that made me get even more excited because there's something that relates to me and found out you as well in there. So if you don't mind, if you have a piece of the story that you'd like to share or an excerpt just so people can hear how the story is read or how you develop the characters. And also for those of you who have not read it yet, it is also available on Audible, so keep that in mind. So
yeah, thank you. I'm going to read a little bit. It's a couple of minutes from chapter 3, which is called The Great Amazonia. And this is the first time that we see Zillah go on stage. So the first time we sort of see her in action. It was the compare's job to introduce me to the audience, to tell them what my story was while I stood silent, waiting in the wings, with Barky at my side. He started with how I'd been found in the jungles of Africa, captured by an intrepid English explorer. Crillick said it was an essential part of making me seem like a real savage, and the crowd fell for it every time. She was brought to London for your delight, the compere said, as if anyone had ever thought about what a collection of clerks and shop girls might want. What did the African make of it all? I wished I could still see him, but the lights were down. He was dressed up like a gent, but did he recognise these tales of the jungle? As the compere jabbered on, nerves started to harden like a rock in my stomach. It was the last thing I needed, especially tonight when it was so important to me to be at my best. The drumbeat that signalled the start of my performance began. I felt it at the back of my throat, the steady thump, thump, thump. The pace increased, and a feeling of fullness worked its way to my chest. Every beat was a blow, and I cringed as they landed. The rhythm grew faster and entered my mind. It crowded out all other thoughts, and the memory of my dance steps fled. The audience had paid handsomely to see my performance. I must show them something. The African sitting 3 rows back. I wanted him to be impressed. The panic built and the drums beat faster still. I covered my ears with my hands like a child, but the beats had gotten into my soul. Now they throbbed inside of me. "Go on, girl, let it out," Barky whispered at my side, and I screamed in response, the sound high and wild and frightened. Barky slapped my behind and jolted me forward onto centre stage. Stunned silence and a moment of blinding light as the spot lamps picked me out. I cast off my cloak and the audience gasped. This is what they saw. A black woman, tall and fearsome, tribal marks on her cheeks and a string of beads and feathers at her throat. Barefoot, her limbs slick with grease, the scandalous shapes of her body barely hidden beneath a close-fitting leopard skin. I couldn't see the audience, but I felt their reaction, the surprise and wonder, a little fear. A low murmur built as the punters whispered to one another. Looking out over their upturned faces, my nerves melted away. I felt powerful.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. That just, number one, just to hear you read. But then also it just gives us a little piece of who Zillah is. Just being in this space and, as you said, feeling powerful, but it's like powerful, but not at the same time.
100%. And I think that's the tension at the start of the book, that she's from a really impoverished background. She wants to make a better life for herself, and it's what she's willing to compromise to make that happen. Mm-hmm. And she's prepared to do almost anything to sort of make her way out of these slums, but it's about the toll it starts to take on her, I think. But yeah, it's that sort of how she comes to terms with, as you say, that feeling that on the one hand, she's looking out, she's feeling powerful, but then she's under the gaze of this audience who thinks she's a savage, and it's sort of quite a compromise that she's making for herself without fully realizing that.
Right. And it just makes me think of, like, even in modern times, how you may have, we have all these artists that come out, and a lot of times they are pushed in a certain direction, not like this, because of course of the time it was different then, but it still rings true today, because you'll have these artists that come out and, they may be, very, whatever it is, whatever the persona that people put on them, that can oftentimes be separate from the talent that they actually have. And then they have to decide, am I going to continue to show up in the world as, this, let's just use overly sexualized person? Is that really who I am? Or am I just doing this because it's what sells and people are telling me that this is what sells, even though I might really be talented, but I'm allowing myself to be sexualized?
Yeah. And I think it's that level of exploitation and how much agency you have. Do you have the ability to make those choices? So you might have these misgivings about what you're doing. Then you think, you have this ambition. Maybe you've been trying to make it for such a long time. And you're like, well, maybe after some time, then once I sort of get a little bit more famous, I'll be able to be a little bit more in control, and I'll be able to sort of set the direction a little bit more. But that's not always the case. And it's about how your image is curated, I suppose, to some extent, and who's in charge of doing that, and what they're bringing to, what are their motivations for encouraging you to appear in a particular way.
Right. And one of the things that was interesting about this story with Zillah, of course, as I said, it's the time. You do mention, or her character mentions, Sarah Bartman. For those who may or may not be familiar with her, tell us who she was and kind of how it paralleled.
Yeah, of course. So she was a person who was exhibited on stage around sort of the earlier part of the 1800s, and was known as the Venus, so a sexualized portrayal, as you say. And at the time, there were sort of questions. So she gained quite a lot of notoriety and fame and celebrity. Yeah, exactly. The Hottentot Venus, which is a derogatory term now, but as she was known at the time, and there was so much interest in her, and she actually was seen to live a relatively privileged life. But of course, she didn't necessarily have agency in her portrayal, and she had a really sad end. She left the UK, left England, and went to France, where she died, and her body parts were exhibited after she died and were only repatriated to South Africa, where she was from, relatively recently, like within the last sort of 10-15 years or so, I think. So that was someone who I had in mind when I was thinking about my character, and I didn't want to write her story because I didn't feel that that was my story to tell. But I thought there's that I was so sort of interested in those tensions and exploring some of those things around the so-called freak shows that were so popular at the time, and that idea that in the Victorian period the world is getting bigger and there's such a fascination in the Victorian gaze with what's different and how people think about it. So that's what I had in the back of my mind when I was writing, for sure.
Definitely. So you get that, you can see that, but the thing with, I guess, with Sarah Bartman or Hottentot Venus is that this was a person who had, it was a real situation, versus in the case with Zillah, it was, they were making it up. And of course, here in the United States, and obviously all around the world, I think of like the blackface and, just all these different things that oftentimes we would have to pretend to be something that we really weren't, just for the entertainment of others.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there is that thing, isn't there, around masking and the expectations of others and how you conform to them. So I suppose in the novel, Zillah is portraying this African savage, is how she's billed at the theatre, and that's what the audience are interested in. That's what they want to see, and that's not who she is at all. But it's those expectations around what it means to be an African, what an African is. And there's no conception that it could be anything other than a savage at that time. So I really wanted to explore that as well.
And as well, we'll get to it in a few minutes. What happens that causes her to start to change her mind about what she's doing, but it's even, I think it's made even more interesting in the fact that Zillah is of mixed race. So I mean, she's not. I mean, of course, she's got African in her. Like one, this much, and you're considered black anyway. But that brings on a whole nother thing, because she's had to, to survive, she's had to choose to walk and live in a certain way, and even, push it, to an even higher level, and have to hide who she really is in many instances.
Yeah, I think so. And I think with there's not that many stories that have in the UK at least that have a black protagonist, and fewer still where they're black and British. So if you have a black lead character, they're often sort of markedly from elsewhere. And it was really important to me that it was someone who was born and raised in London, to reflect that particular identity that I think we just don't see that much of, particularly in historical fiction.
Right, and that's true, because like her mother, we'll talk about her for a moment. Her mother came from Barbados. So yes. Yes,
Yeah.
Laura is saying timely publication, more and more truths are being revealed, and it's a wonderful thing. That is true because as much as I can't speak for what's happening in the UK, but here in the United States, people are trying to not tell the truth. They're trying to ban books and, not wanting us to understand certain things about history. So it is very important for writers like yourself, who are not afraid to tell these stories so that people can know that, that there was an existence of Black people in these spaces, and that they showed up in a lot of different ways within these spaces.
I think that's true. I think in the UK there's a perception among quite a lot of people that you didn't really have Black people in England until the sort of the arrival of the Empire Windrush, with people from the Caribbean who were invited over to help rebuild after the Second World War. And that's just so untrue. The history, the records show that there are around sort of between 10 and 15,000 Black people living in London from sort of the late 1700s and into the 1800s, and some of those were slaves. Some of them had come from America, where they'd fought for the British side in the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually quite a lot of people. There's a history of Black people going sort of much further back than that. But when I was doing my research, just the numbers were quite surprising, considering the sort of lack of information or teaching that we have about that. And I think that sometimes with history, fiction can be a great way of getting into that and being able to visualize and imagine the stories. So I think it's the stories that can be quite powerful, and I suppose being able to explore some of that is a nice gateway in. And I have seen a couple of reviews and people have said maybe that they didn't realise how many Black people there were at the time in London, and they've gone off to do their own research, and that's amazing for me. So I'm like, they've read this and now they're sort of learning more themselves, which is amazing for me. And I love it when I just see like a period drama or I read a book and I'm like, oh, I want to know more about that. So that's an amazing reaction. I love that.
Yes, and that's definitely powerful for you as well, because you sparked something to cause people to want to, learn more and all of that. Because one of the things, since I have been interviewing a lot of authors over the last few years, I can't necessarily say that historical fiction was my favorite when I started, but now it is. Just simply for what you just said, an opportunity to learn more about, who we are, and telling it in stories, and then interweaving things that are, real, things that actually happen and historical and all of these things into it. It makes a difference, and it makes me want to learn more and figure out more about some of these historical stories. Yes, Laura is saying she recently learned more about Black Irish. Yes, and we did a book a few weeks ago that was talking about the Black and the Irish in the United States. So yes, a lot of things that you just don't know until you may pick up a fictional thing and actually learn something in the process. Yes, and Suzette Harrison is saying she loves African American historical fiction as a means of learning. She actually writes African American historical fiction. So everybody be on the lookout for Suzette Harrison. If you haven't read any of her stuff yet, she is one of our faves, has been here a few times. So but but I want to speak to Zillah's mom for a moment, because Zillah's mom, she's not like a primary character in the story, but yet and still her story is important, because what happens with her kind of helps Zillah to figure some things out later on in her own life without us telling the story. Her mom influences her, even though she's not an active character in the story. So tell us a little bit about her.
Yeah, so as you'd said, she's from Barbados, and she was enslaved, and she is in the UK, and she works in a big house, and that's when she has Zillah, and she is really determined for Zillah to not have the same life that she had, and so she really instills in her this mantra around being born free, and in doing so, I think that gives Zillah a real sense of sort of responsibility for making the most of that status and sort of carving out a life for herself. And there'll be sort of throughout the book, there's sort of different flashbacks and memories of her mother, and she's really sort of guided by what she said, but at the same time she's had sort of quite a difficult relationship with her as well, and she's sort of coming to terms with that, and part of her growth is sort of being able to sort of understand some of the things that her mother has done, and she sort of starts to realize that later on as the book goes on.
Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that, and we read this oftentimes, there are real world stories of mothers who did, similar things without telling the whole story. Sometimes the mom will have to make a decision about how her child will be raised, or, who's going to do the raising of the child as a means of protection of her child. And we know that that is something that has happened throughout our history, whether it's leaving the child with a family member. Sometimes in worst case scenarios, people may have, killed their children so they didn't have to be enslaved, or whatever the case may be. So, her mother was, even though she wasn't there throughout the entire story, it plays a big factor in how, Zillah is thinking as she goes forward. And also it explains, in my opinion, why she was willing to take on this job that maybe she would not have done initially under normal circumstances, because anything, she didn't want to be a servant.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the book is a lot about race, of course, but it's also about social class, and again, the limited options at that intersection, because at the sort of time period, if you worked in a big house, you were a servant, you lived in, so that house is providing your accommodation, and if you lose your job, you lose your home. So that brings with it lots of conflict and tensions in terms of what your employer may want or demand or expect from you. And I think that was something that I also wanted to think about a little bit as well, and just how few options you have when you are from lower down the social classes, definitely when you're working class at that period particularly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that Zillah is able to do, she meets the Viscount as she's working, Vincent, as she's working this job as the Great Amazonia, and they embark on a relationship, which I find quite interesting as well. Throughout history, we see these types of relationships.
Yeah, I think so. And again, she is the performance. She's doing her performances, and he has been in the audience watching on and become attracted to her, and she's become his mistress. And they have this relationship that's been going a little while, and that's another source of tension and conflict for her, because while she's with him, she's sort of living the high life. They're staying in Westminster in a nice area. If she's not with him, she's back in the slums. And again, it's all about those things around how much you're willing to compromise in order to sort of get what you want or be more comfortable. And it's quite a struggle for her, but there is, I think, a real sense of sort of she does have feelings for him, and I think this and vice versa. So how their relationship develops is something that I enjoyed writing, actually.
Yes. Well, I know, of course, you loved writing Zillah just because she's so multifaceted. Were there any other particular characters that you really could get into their story or their backstory that you really enjoyed that process?
I think so. I really liked Barky, who's the character that I mentioned briefly in the excerpt, and he is the stagehand at the Variety Theatre, and he really looks after all the performers and keeps an eye out for Zillah and tries to stop her from getting into too many scrapes. And they have sort of quite a nice dynamic where sometimes she needs a friend and he can be that person for her, but is also trying to sort of keep her on the straight and narrow, not get too above herself now that she's the starring role. So he was quite a good character to write for me. But even with Crillick, who's my villain, it can be quite fun to write a villain as well. Yeah, I did enjoy the writing process, and the researching was a lot of fun.
Right, yes, Crillick. Crillick was something else. Because of course he discovers Zillah and hires her to work for him, and then he's like, "Oh, this is going pretty good. People like what she's doing. I'm making this money with her, so let me see how I can take this to another level and be able to do more with it." Which that just once again, even though it's in Victorian times, that kind of stuff happens now. Be like, oh, okay, this is successful. So let me see what I can drum up over here.
Yeah, and I think when you have unscrupulous people who have bad motivations, and especially if they have power and money, it can be quite difficult to put a stop to that. There's not necessarily, definitely in that time period, really the checks and balances in terms of what people can do outside of social disapproval.
Right.
So I think there's quite a lot of space for nefarious people to do bad things, for sure.
And I mean that just rings true. Just thinking about the fact, it's this whole quote unquote freak show thing that people are getting into at this time, and really hurting people who may really be going through some challenges. And I just think I'm skipping ahead a little bit in the story, but with the character that Zillah goes to try to help, that they were just abusing her as a Black woman, as a quote unquote freak. But then again, it makes you think of the ways that as Black people, oh, they don't feel pain, or they don't, all these things that are said about us, that it's okay for us to mistreat them. It's okay for us to poke and prod and cut and do whatever. Oh, Cassandra, the book is Theater of Marvels by Lianne Dillsworth. But yes, that is something that is true and has gone throughout history.
Yeah, I think I've seen research before that says if people have been shown sort of different expressions on faces, they don't always recognize pain on Black faces. And I think that's really important. I think it plays a role as well in worse outcomes for Black women in pregnancy, particularly. And I think that's sort of fairly common to have a worse outcome as a Black mother. So I think there's lots of, as much as it's a historical piece, as you've said, there's quite a few contemporary resonances that are in there, and things that you question, sort of what's the equivalent today, and to what extent are we still in sort of some of these positions, even though it's a different time period. It's not going to be exactly the same, but there is definitely some linkage between the two time periods. And that's also why I really like the Victorian period, because it's obviously quite a while ago, but it's just close enough for you to be able to see some of the sort of the hangovers from the period, in terms of when you're walking around the streets in London. You've got a lot of the architecture there, and A lot of the establishments, that's when a lot of the brand names and companies were being built up in that time. So I think you get there can be quite a Victorian feel within London, and it was a time of massive change. So you had the Industrial Revolution, we've had lots of changes in the tech world with the birth of the internet and things. So I think there's lots of read across to sort of the cultural moment in that. Then there was a time of real sense of progress, but also of anxiety. And what does it mean when the world feels like it's getting smaller and things that you didn't think were possible now are? And I think we have some of the same things within sort of the times that we're living through as well. And I'm sort of quite interested when you can use historical fiction and refract some of the questions and concerns through that prism.
That is so true. That is so true. To see that, those parallels for one, and they always say history repeats itself. So, it just looks a little different because of the technology or the fashion or, whatever. It looks different, but history definitely repeats itself. Now, I'm going to get into Lucian now, because when Zillah encounters Lucian is when she begins to start making some shifts in her way of thinking, just because of the things that he's presenting to her as well, I'll let you tell us who he is.
He is he shows up very early on in the story, and he is an African man. He would be considered, I suppose, part of the middle class in some ways. So his background is that he's had a patron who has set him up with his own business, an English patron who set him up with his own business, and he's very confident in who he is and his identity, and he is the first person who questions Zillah on what she's doing and why, and he understands that she is sort of has this deception when he comes to see her, and that's the first sort of poke of her conscience, I suppose. And as the story progresses, she sort of gets a little bit closer to him and starts to sort of consider some of the questions he's putting to her, and she starts to see things in a different light, I think, and he is the first one that prompts that line of thinking, as you say.
Right, because he's one of the few African characters, or Black characters, at least that we know of at the time, that she's actually in communication with, who can potentially pose questions or ask her about have you thought about what it is that you're doing and how it can impact others. But this is one of the things that stood out to me about him. She meets him and, they begin to have this communication. But one of the big things he's doing is helping Africans who are coming through London to go to Sierra Leone, which, as I told you earlier, I found out last year, my maternal heritage tracks back to Sierra Leone through DNA. And you say your dad is from Sierra Leone, so that excites me to know that, and to see that. I'm sorry.
My granddad.
Oh, your granddad. I'm sorry, but yes, just to see that. So that, but was there a particular reason why Sierra Leone and maybe not another African country, or was that something that was really happening in London at that time?
I used a little creative license with the timings, but yeah, that's a real dimension of how Sierra Leone was built up. So there was a big campaign. So, as I said, the Black population in London towards the end of the 1700s was a lot of people who had come from elsewhere, and if they going into the early part of the 1800s, once slavery had officially sort of ended in the colonies, didn't have slavery in the UK in the same way. So this was offshore, essentially. There was a lot of people with sort of no jobs and nothing to do. So then they became seen as the black poor. They were sort of homeless and marginalised and rough sleeping. And there was a lobby who were really keen to get them off the streets. Mm-hmm. And that intersected with, I suppose, a movement more in the sort of the Marcus Garvey style approach of a place for Black Africans where they could develop and be sort of masters of their own destiny in a way that they weren't able to in the London of the time. So yeah, that's all real history. There was I think at least 3 early attempts to sort of establish a settlement within Sierra Leone, and it sort of grew over time. And yeah, there was a lot of sort of thinkers at the time who really advocated this scheme for sort of different motives, as I say, but it intersected quite nicely. But it foundered a little bit because it was a time when there was still people being taken from the area and surrounding areas and being enslaved. So there was sort of a patch where they were trying to create a settlement, but it's still quite vulnerable there to sort of raiders from outside. So yes, it was sort of a formative time in Sierra Leonean history.
Because yes, I'm familiar with Freetown, but as I said, when reading your book, I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't, I knew about Freetown and people going there and things like that, but I just didn't have a lot. I haven't had a chance to dig deeper to get some of the history of how that happened and how people went there. So I just as you said, mentioned Marcus Garvey, the whole go back to Africa, movement. So just to see that these were things that were going on there as well, and that there were, people actively, like the character of Lucien, actually helping folks to do that and make their way, and just getting the information and learning about what that whole process is like. So I found that quite interesting. But just the mere fact that he was, he had been an enslaved person and had this person who, helped him, his, you said the word already, it's not coming to me right now, but his sponsor, so to speak, to help him to be able to move ahead and not have to always be an enslaved person. So I found that powerful as well, to see that as a business owner and other things that he was.
Yeah, and I think again, there's an amazing map that's been put together by one of the universities, and it pinpoints all the Black people that were in London in the Victorian period, and where there's traces in the historical record, and you can sort of find different people, but that story is quite feasible because there were a lot of I don't know, a lot's probably not fair, but there were definitely instances where that was happening. And I think it was important to recognise that one of the things I was really keen to do was show that there's more than one way of being Black in London society at that time. And so I've got different characters who have different experiences, and I really wanted to show that diversity of Black experience.
And that is important because a lot of people, just like in current times, we're not a monolith. We weren't at that time either. People come through and have different experiences, and and they walk through the world differently because of their race, and as you also mentioned, because of class. Class can open up, different, or caste or class can open up different opportunities for people. And back to our main character, Zillah, she had an opportunity to kind of see both sides based upon how she came up the world that she was thrust into as the great Amazonia, and then learning even more when she encounters Lucian, because those weren't things that she necessarily played out in her day-to-day life.
Yeah, I think that's true, because she's an actor, obviously, because she's portraying this role on stage, but she's also an actor in her personal life, because she's switching between, one day she's in the St. Giles area, which is where it was known as a sort of a rookery at the time, where you've got sort of people living in really unsanitary, cramped conditions, multiple families to a house, people sharing rooms and things. And I think that that's one part of her experience. Then when she's with Vincent, and she gets to live a completely different life, and it's where she feels that she most belongs. I think that is something she struggles with, because she needs to sort of carve out a path for herself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And someone's asking about Pablo Fonqui. I may be saying it wrong. I don't believe Pablo's in the book.
No, I didn't use anyone who was real in the book, although some of the people are inspired by real people. So there's one character who is starts out as a boxer, but he owns a public house. He owns a pub that Lucian and Zillah go to, and that's based on a boxer at the time whose surname I think was Richmond, and he was born in America and had made a lot of money as a prize fighter, and used his profits to buy a pub. So although that was in the previous century, I wanted to think about how he might have developed and how his business might have grown and developed over time, and all as part of creating that sort of Black London. Because I think that, going back, I suppose, to what we were saying earlier on, when you watch period dramas of the time, sometimes if there's a Black character in a period drama, people really question that, and they're like, oh, is that there? Are they there for like diversity casting? Is that tokenism? Were they really there? And the answer is yes. And it's how we put them into the stories that into the narratives that they've been left out of previously, and sort of enable them to reclaim that historical space.
And yes, and as we've already said, that's just so important, because you would never know if someone didn't take the time to tell the stories. So I know you had mentioned Bridgerton earlier, because the person who reads the audio of your book is in Bridgerton. So, but that is fictionalized. So some people may think, oh, okay, it's got modern music, things like that. So, but just to understand that there may have been cases where we actually were in the room.
Yeah, I think that's true. And with the woman who reads the audiobook, her name's Catherine Drysdale, and she plays the modiste in Bridgerton, so the woman who's making the dresses for the various families. And she has quite an interesting story as well, that's not a million miles away from some of the things that Zillah experiences in terms of how she sort of presents herself to build up her business. But it's great to see a character with their own business, with some sense of agency. And I think with a show like Bridgerton, it does enable people to sort of visualize and see people in those spaces, and it makes it feel more possible sometimes. So I think that's really important. But I love the way she reads the audiobook. She does it so much justice. It was really the first time I heard it. It's like, oh, it's weird. It was like the way she was speaking, the character was like how I had heard it in my head. So yeah, I've been really pleased with that. That's been one of the lovely things as part of the sort of publishing journey.
Yes, and as I mentioned to you, I read some, and then I listened to some as well, and it was good to hear that, because it's like, okay, I'm hearing it in the voice, because in my American voice, of course, it's It's not the same. So, okay, we do have a question here from Laura, who's at work. Thank you for listening while you're at work. Hopefully, your boss doesn't see that. In the U.S., there is a community where many circus performers retire to, creating their own community among like-minded people. Is there a similar community in the UK? This is fascinating history. Can't wait to read your book.
Oh, that's kind. I don't know is the answer, but I feel like there might be. I think is it small theatre, small acts or something? I can't remember. There's a slightly different terminology in the US for those performers and where they appeared, but I can't imagine that there wouldn't have been or that there isn't. And I think that it's something that I would like to find out more about. So yeah, I'm going to take down the name of the community, and I think it's something I'd like to find out more about. The thing is, there's so many things. You go down these rabbit holes and you want to find out more and more and more all the time. So it's the worst thing for me to think, oh, I want to learn about this now. So that will be my next thing.
Right. That is true because, of course, as you have seen, we have not given anything away. So, but that's one of the things that happens because, there are these performers, these Africans who are turned into performers or circus acts or whatever the case may be. And there's some things that happen that we kind of really don't know where their story we know where it ends in the point in the book, but we don't really know what's going to happen to them later on. Will they be able to go to Sierra Leone or a place like that, or do they end up staying in London? We don't know because that story isn't told. But she does. Laura, thank you for that question because it does bring up a good point. When you have people in these different circumstances, what does end up happening with them? So
yeah,
good question.
It's true. Yeah, and one of the early reviewers, another writer called Stacey Thomas, she had read the novel and she's like, oh, I want a sequel. I was like, oh, I'm writing something different at the moment, but I think
right.
There was lots of questions that she had, and I had always envisaged it as a single book, but she's like, oh, I want to know this, I want to know this, I want to know this. So I was like, okay, yeah. And then I was starting to think about that as well. So yeah, I think there's sort of a lot of places that you could take it, definitely.
Because we do get a little bit of what happens with Zillah, but the other, some of the others we really, you get, it's a snippet, but not enough to like really dive into what's going on. So that is something. So now you mentioned, because we're getting close to our time now. So you mentioned that you were working on some other things now. So also in the Victorian era, because that's your expertise, or are you doing something a little different?
Yeah, no, still in that era. I feel like I did lots of research. I want to squeeze everything I can out of it.
I know that's right.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So, and I really do love the period, and I think there's so many sort of different things that can be said. So I'm working on my second book to be published at the moment, but still in quite the early stages. And so at the same time as I'm talking to people about Theatre of Marvels, which is obviously not long came out on the 12th of April, didn't it, in the US, and a little later on in April here in the UK. And then I'm writing the second book. So yeah, there's a few different things going on, and every so often I'll see something, someone will send a tweet or something about a particular piece of research. There's a big exhibition at the moment in Liverpool around someone who was, his name's John Blank, in the Tudor period, a black trumpet player. And I'm really interested. Yeah, so I started and I was like, oh, I'd love to go to Liverpool and go to the museum there and find out a little bit more. So there's always something that catches your eye and a different story that you want to tell.
Mm-hmm. And it's so important that you continue to tell these stories. I mean, it's interesting to me as an American, so I can only imagine what your fellow Brits feel about it. Just to hear these stories and learn more about the history, because there are so many things that, no pun intended, get whitewashed, that we get left out, that we don't know what was really going on with some of the men or some of the women. Just like a quick side note, yesterday I went on a cemetery tour here in the Atlanta area, and some people are like, "Oh, cemetery tour," but it was just interesting. The tour guide was just giving us the history of this, grand place that at one point in time was segregated, and then they decided, okay, we're going to have some blacks here, but the blacks are in a certain section. And then later on they desegregated the cemetery. But you're thinking, she told stories of there were like enslaved women who worked for people, and they had to get special permission to bury them with their the family that they worked for, because the white family that was next door was like, I don't know if I want this black person buried next to me. I mean, so yeah, you think you're dead. I mean, what difference does it make? But just to know that it runs that deep. So all of the things that we can learn, and go back and look at those names and figure out stories and things like that, do the research and create. I think that's powerful, whether it's here or where you are. So thank you, Leanne. Appreciate that. And thank you so much for your time, because I know it's almost 10 o'clock your time, so you're probably ready to call it a night.
No, the night is young.
No, it's young. Oh, okay. All right. You're partying on a Monday night. Go, girl. She's like, oh, this is nothing. Well, quick question though, because I know that you write, and I know there's some writers in the room, and oftentimes I will ask about when you do have a day job, which you do, when you are multitasking, which you are, how do you find time to write, or what is kind of your process for making sure that you do find time to do the research and the writing to be able to produce such great works for us?
I'm quite a night owl, so I usually work sort of 8 till 6-ish, and then I tend to write sort of fairly late in the evening. So when I was writing Theatre of Marvels, I would sort of start around sort of 9-10 in the evening and go on till about 2 or so. And
oh, wow.
Yeah, and I think as time goes on, I'm like, oh, I don't know I can do that anymore. I'm starting to realise
right, right.
But
right.
So I tend to do most of my writing in the evenings and at weekends. And it can be a struggle to fit in. You said when we started about having had a break, and I think it's good to be able to have a break every so often and sort of replenish and refresh, because I think when you do something outside of your sort of day job, for want of a better word, I think it's important to sort of protect your time and sort of set some boundaries around that, which I'm not always great at with the writing, because you sort of get into it, you want to find out more, and you get carried away. So yeah.
Laura's asking, did you have a lot of control with the editing of your story?
I really wanted to be traditionally published because I was really excited about the editing process. So when I did my MA in creative writing, we used to workshop every week, and we'd share sort of excerpts and have critique, give each other critique. And the editing was really collaborative, really helpful, and very open. So I was never told, you must do X, but it was often sort of questions that sometimes I hadn't thought of. So I might be asked about a particular character and what's their motivation. I'd say, oh, they're doing this, this, and this for this reason, but that wasn't necessarily on the page. So I had to make sure that it was represented. So I was really lucky with my editors. We had a really great relationship, and being able to sort of work with them and see the book through their eyes was actually really interesting, because they're looking at it as readers, and that was the first time that had really happened, obviously because not really that many people had seen it when I went to get it published, or they'd only seen like sort of little chunks at a time. So yeah, I really enjoyed the editing process.
And that's good to know because, and this last thing I'm gonna say, then I'm gonna let you go. So go write or rest, whichever, depending on depending on what you're doing this evening. But that's, I just think that was a good question, first of all, but then also just thinking of that process, because as you know, more and more of our stories, meaning stories of Black people, are being told, but they're being published in, you know, traditional ways to make sure that those stories are remaining true to what they're supposed to be, and you are, that others aren't coming in and trying to tell you what your story should be, or you know, or tell you how this person should speak, or you know, how this person would feel, because oftentimes they don't really know because it's not their experience. So that's good to know that you had a positive experience.
Yeah, it was great. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, that's good. Well, thank you again, Leanne, for your time. Thank you for everyone watching. I never know what it's going to be when I come on earlier, but we have people who sneak and do it at work, so it's perfect. So, you know, if you get a chance to watch this later or go back and do a replay or share it out to someone who you know has interest in historical fiction, specifically the Victorian London, which is something different for us to learn about, please do share Leanne's book out with them, because I'm sure that they will enjoy it, and we will continue to be on the lookout for the next one whenever that comes. So thanks again for everyone's time. Leanne, if you hold on for just one more second, I'm going to let everybody else go. And I look forward to seeing you again. Just real quick, I know I just came back, but I won't be here next week because it's a holiday and I'll be traveling. And I know you all will probably be busy while I'm celebrating Memorial Day here in the United States. So I'll be back in 2 weeks and let you know who that's going to be at that time. So sometime between now and then. So you all have a good one. I'll see you then real soon. And Leanne, hold on for 1 second. Thank you again for your time.